There are two ways to cross the cell membrane. You can either freely cross it, right, just go at random back and forth, or you can have help. That we said very small things, right? They're going to freely pass because they can fit through those spaces. They can wiggle through, no problem. And you kind of just come and go as you please when you freely pass. You just move in and out. Because remember, particles in motion, they're always bouncing off each other. And that bouncing sends them in random directions, and that can send them through the membrane. Sometimes they need help. When you freely pass through the membrane, that's called passive transport. When you freely pass through, it's called passive transport. And it just happens. When you need help, it's called active transport. When you need help, it's called active transport. Active transport requires energy. So active transport requires energy. And passive transport does not require energy. So up here I have my great big beaker, right? Just a great big beaker of water. A drop of food dye. It's going to happen. All right, so it could be different shades. Keep in mind, describing it from beginning to end. Only one drop. Where it started, describe the depth of color where it started when I first dropped it in. This is green, by the way.
Dark.
It was very dark, and it's moving towards what? The bottom. Only the bottom, or is it also spreading out to the sides? You used a particular word to describe it. What is it going to do? It's going to diffuse. Passive transport. So we said passive is the stuff that requires no energy, right? The first kind of passive transport that just naturally happens is called diffusion. And that's what we're looking at in the beaker right now. My green food dye is diffusing throughout the beaker from an area where there was a lot of it to an area where there was a little of it. So consider it like moving downhill. There's lots of food dye at the top of the hill, right? And naturally, it moves down the hill. It's going to roll to where there is none. And it does that on its own. Just like if I were to start a ball rolling at the top of a hill, do I have to do anything other than let go of it? And it just goes. Same thing here. I didn't stir it. I didn't heat it. I didn't touch it. I dropped it in. And over the course of the rest of this hour, it's going to spread out until what? It's all green. It's all even, right? There's no shades. So we're going to leave it there for a while because things in my beaker, they're just going to continue moving. Diffusion does the same thing. It moves from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration by itself. No added energy. It does that by itself. So if I were to ask you to draw what diffusion looks like, this would be an accurate drawing from an area of high concentration to low concentration. When we talk about different concentrations of things, we call it a concentration gradient. So when you move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, we call that moving down the concentration gradient. So my green dye is moving down the concentration gradient. No energy required, just does it by bouncing.
So, like, comparing it, the concentration gradient would be like the hill or the wall?
The hill. So that if we're comparing it to our diagram, the concentration gradient is the hill, and the ball is the thing that's going to do the moving. So the particles will do the moving. And they move from high concentration to low. One of my favorite examples of that, for you guys that you understand quite well, I avoid the mall as often as I can. Most of my shopping online now, because the mall is a very stressful, people-filled place. There are several stores that you can smell from a mile away. Yes.
You don't like people, how do you run that?
Be faster than the slow people, and you're in a pack that is much thinner.
Oh.
The faster you are, the fewer people you have to deal with. It's true. Keep that in mind. It's very uncomfortable at the start. Like miles 1 through 3 are very stressful because there's a lot of people in one spot. I did not enjoy that. So there are a few stores. White Barn.
Yankee Candle.
Yankee Candle.
White Castle.
Bath and Body Works.
Bath and Body Works.
When you first like.
Hollister.
Yeah.
Abercrombie. What do all these stores have in common?
Strong smell.
You can smell them from across the mall. And that's one thing I hate because I'm asthmatic. So I walk by those things and I can't breathe.
It's like when you're.
Now you're like, you're asthmatic and you run marathons. I know.
It's like when you walk through like Macy's or.
I thoroughly enjoyed defying every possible rule. And you naturally understand, what you don't know is employees of Hollister, Abercrombie, and Bath and Body Works, one of the things their managers have them do, and it's actually written into the instructions for an employee, is every so many minutes they are supposed to take a sample bottle of whatever product it is they're selling and go spray it at the entrance. There's an employee whose that's their job, is to assault the rest of us. That smell goes from an area of high concentration of odor, right, of gas. It's just a gas that they're spraying, aerosolized scent. And it goes from that area of high concentration to low concentration. Does that take any energy?
No.
It just happens. If I want to make that smell, like I so often want to, go back to the store from where it came, do I have to exert any energy?
Yes.
So I'm going to go get, those big fans they put out at the mall to dry the floor when it's raining? So I should just go get those big fans, plug them in, and line them up outside of those stores and force all of the air back in.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It takes energy to go against the concentration gradient. I'd have to get fans. To make it go from an area of low concentration to high, it requires an input of energy. That's not passive transport, that's active transport. So passive, no energy, down the concentration gradient. To go back up the hill, it's just like sledding. Everybody knows the part of sledding that sucks is the going back up the hill. Why? It takes energy.
And a long time.
Unless you're me and you sled at my house and you make your husband park the tractor at the end of the hill, and then you can just drive the tractor back up the hill and then sled down it. I would never do something that irresponsible. You should do it. There's a cup holder on the tractor, so you can make sure that there's hot chocolate too. I'm so lazy. It's kind of sad. Hollister? I don't know. Hollister looks like clothing for people much younger than me, so I try not to go in there. You all know that you're creeped out by the adults that shop in the juniors department. You should be. So I don't go in them because, I mean, come on. If I show up wearing anything from stores intended for people your age, that would be awkward.
Well, you can rock a sweatshirt.
I strike you as a sweatshirt kind of girl.
Could be.
I think I own 3 sweatshirts. And I own 3 sweatshirts because I used to coach, and my teams wanted to get sweatshirts. That's it.
How'd that work out?
So, diffusion does not have to be any particular kind of molecule. Here, oh, look at our food dye. It was a good time to check back in. It's getting there, isn't it? It's getting there by itself. I pretty much forgot about it. So diffusion is the word we use for when any molecule moves down its concentration gradient. We use a special word for when it's water. The diffusion of water is called osmosis. That's when water moves down its concentration gradient. Now all of this stuff has to do with cells. That's the part we haven't seen yet, is how this affects cells. Now, if I was smart, this is how I would do it. What do you guys think?
Osmosis is part of the movement, or just how the water diffuses?
Water diffusing. Oh, there we go. Uh-oh. Where's my photo stream? Oh. Nope. Uh-oh. Well, we'll do it this way. Okay. There's my beaker, and there's my cell. And I will tell you that outside of the cell is 5% salt. And inside of the cell is 10% salt. But here's the problem. Salt can't freely pass the membrane because it's charged. It's an Na plus and a Cl minus. And we already said it's not possible. It gets stuck. Something has to help it even out the concentrations. And there's our selectively permeable membrane, right? What can freely pass? Water. If this is 5% salt, what percentage of water is it? If it's 5% salt, what percent water is it? If it's 10% salt, what percent water is it? Water will freely move down its concentration gradient. So from where the concentration is higher to where the concentration is lower. So what direction will water move? Will it move into the cell or out of the cell? It's going to move into the cell. Because 95% is bigger than 90%, right? So it moves until the concentrations are the same.
Wait, but how would the concentrations be the same if it's flowing inside the cell?
So what's going to happen, this is just a ratio, right?
Yeah.
So this is just saying for every 100 particles, we have 90 waters and 10 salts. And out here, we have 5 salts for 95 waters.
But I thought they were supposed to even out the salt.
They will. And here's how they'll do it. If water moves inside, it's going to change the ratio of salt to water, right?
Oh, okay.
So it does it by it just increasing this since we can't change the salt concentration. Everybody follow that train of logic? Because sometimes it's a little confusing. When it's the solvent that moves and not the solute, that's when you're like. When we compare concentrations, higher, lower, and equal, we label them. So this process has a specific name, and we can label the movement of water. When the concentration of solute. So here we're talking about the salt concentration. When the salt concentration is greater, so inside the cell, 10% is greater than 5%, right? So we call that hypertonic. Sure. When the salt concentrations, the solute concentration inside the cell is higher than it is outside of the cell, we call that hypertonic. Bad news is, if this is an animal cell and too much water flows in, the cell explodes. That's why it's important if you are dehydrated and you go to the hospital and they give you an IV, they don't give you an IV of water. They give you an IV of salt water. Because if they give you pure water, it will make your blood cells explode. Then you have a bigger problem than being dehydrated. You know, death typically is a fairly large problem.
This salt is solute.
Solute. So water flows in. If it's an animal cell, that explodes. If it's a plant cell, it has a rigid cell wall. So it just becomes turgid. That's what we call it.
So the water helps the salt flow in?
Yeah. Well, no. The water is what does the flowing in. It makes the relationship even. The salt stays where it is. I'll show you a video. If you drink water, your body will actually expel most of it, and you can't take it. That's why you use Gatorade when you're dehydrated, or Pedialyte, or something like that. There's salt dissolved in there to help you maintain homeostasis. So it's basically, if you're that dehydrated, like that significantly dehydrated, water won't help. Let's take a look at another cell and see if you can't figure out what'll happen. Okay. We have our solute concentrations. This time, the cell isn't hypertonic. It's not higher concentration. This time it's lower. So we call that hypotonic. Remember, salt can't move through the membrane freely. It will not diffuse. So we have to think about water. 5% salt means it's what percent water? 3% salt means it's what percent water? What direction is water going to move with respect to the cell? In or out? So we would just draw an arrow out.
How do you know it?
The cell is going to shrink. How do you know?
How do you know it's going to move in this inside the cell?
So remember we said it moves with respect to the concentration gradient. So it goes from where it's a higher concentration to lower. 97 and 95. Which number's higher? So it moves from inside towards where it's lower.
So the water's gonna go?
Because the salt can't move, right? We said salt's charged. It doesn't freely pass any membrane. So water has to move in response. So we did higher concentration. We did lower concentration. That means there's only one ability left. The same. Is there a word in geometry that means the same? Equilateral, so equal. How about a particular kind of triangle?
On your
isosceles?
No, isosceles is two of them. One.
So isosceles is two equal sides?
Yeah.
So if I have two equal sides here, it's isotonic. The same. Two equal sides. Tonicity is what the word we use to refer to concentrations of things. So hypertonic, hypotonic, and isotonic. Iso means the same. Now, based on what we've already done, 5% salt makes it what percent water? 5% salt makes it what percent water? If it's 95% inside and 95% outside, what happens? It stays the same concentration, so there's equal movement in and out. There's equal movement in and out, and we call that no net movement. No net movement. If you always take 2 steps forward and 2 steps back, you end up in the same place every time. This is all passive transport, requires no energy, moves down a concentration gradient. Let's take a look. Down their concentration gradient that are too big to fit through those tiny spaces in the cell membrane. Remember those proteins, those transmembrane proteins you guys drew me? Those act as a gate or channel to allow things to freely pass through the membrane, and we call it facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion still moves down the concentration gradient. So it still moves down, but it requires a gate or a passage. So like a dog door at the bottom of your door. It allows the dog to pass freely, but the dog's not going to just like squish through the space below the door without the door on it, right? It's not going to happen. So facilitated diffusion, still passive, it just requires a carrier protein. See you guys tomorrow.